Good afternoon and welcome to the League of Women Voters Woodbury Cottage Grove area post-redistricting listening sessions program. My name is Vivian Latimer Tannehill. I'm a member of the Woodbury Cottage Grove area League redistricting team and part of the board of directors. I will be performing some league housekeeping duties and providing a brief overview of the purpose of the meeting today. Before we begin, we'd like for you to be aware that this Zoom meeting is being recorded and will be posted to our website. Attendees who do not wish to appear in the recording should turn off their videos and change their name to only their first names. For those of you who are not familiar with the League of Women Voters and our organization, it is a grassroots, unbiased national network and membership organization that believes in the freedom to vote, believes that the freedom to vote is nonpartisan. The League does not support or oppose candidates or political parties at any level of government. We work to empower voters and defend democracy, encourage informed and active participation in government, and influence public policy through education and advocacy. This afternoon's program is a direct response to participants who attended the 2 July 2022 redistricting listening sessions. Participants identified 9 reoccurring topics that they needed additional information about. The redistricting committee has identified someone with excellent knowledge in the area of voting, redistricting guidelines, and the process to speak to us today and to answer your questions. Lastly, before I turn this program over to our redistricting team chair, and who will introduce our speaker and provide additional instructions, on behalf of our team, I would like to apologize for the delay in bringing this program to you. Our league has been involved in candidate forums where candidates in the upcoming elections answers questions raised by leagues and voters. It's an excellent program, and if you've not had the opportunity to watch them, then please visit our website, LWVWCG at leagueofwomenvotersminnesota.org. I will put that in the chat as well. Now I would like to turn the program over to Dawn Tuvison, our extraordinary League of Women Voters redistricting team chair. Dawn?
Thank you, Vivian, and welcome everyone, and thank you for joining. On behalf of the League of Women Voters Woodbury Cottage Grove area redistricting team and the League of Women Voters Woodbury Cottage Grove board and members, I would like to thank all of you for participating in the July listening sessions and also attending this evening. I would like to say a little something about redistricting and our team before I pass on to our guest speaker. When our team first came together in December 2019, we were like deer looking into headlights. Some of you may have felt that way when you first or we first met in July. We wondered and we asked, what is redistricting and why does it matter? And what's going to, or how are we going to connect, educate, and engage the community? These were some of the questions that we've wrestled with for the last 2.5 years. There were some of our, I think we can all agree today that redistricting is very important and it matters to us each and every day, each and every one of us, single day, not just every 10 years following the census. So going forward, the magic question is, what are we all going to do about keeping redistricting, the discussion and the awareness alive? So that's something to think about as we're spending time together and as we go on after we leave tonight. At this time, I would like to introduce to you our guest speaker, Paul Huffman, who has been very helpful and to the redistricting team for the past 2.5 years. Frankly, I don't think I could have done this without him. So as a volunteer staff member, Paul works with national state organizations to provide information, tools, and support for local leagues and members to assist them in and redistricting efforts. Paul is also the League of Women Voters Woodbury Cottage Grove Area Voter Services Chair and is a member of our MAPS Minnesota Campaign Steering Committee for Redistricting. He's also a member of League of Women Voters Cottage Grove Area. Also, he was a nuclear submarine officer in the United States Navy, and he's retired from the United States Naval Service and retired from Xcel Energy in 2019 as General Manager, Nuclear Fleet Operations. So, Paul, thank you very much for leading this meeting tonight, and I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thanks, Dawn. And thank you, Vivian, for hosting this program. I really appreciate this opportunity. I would ask if one of you could enable participant sharing, please, in the security.
You should have it already.
Yeah, Dawn's a co-host.
And you should be as well.
I am not.
Okay. Do it again. How's it now?
Now I am. Okay, thank you. All right. Well, I appreciate this opportunity. You know, I'll run through some slides, do my best to answer the questions, you know, and understand it's a challenge with people not physically present in order to cover this information. You know, my name is Paul Huffman. As Dawn introduced, I'm the redistricting coordinator for League of Women Voters Minnesota. I am also, as she mentioned, part of you know, the statewide alliance on redistricting that worked in advance of this most recent redistricting cycle, and I've been part of several national working groups and panels on redistricting. So I've had a lot of exposure and talked to a lot of people both within Minnesota and nationally on redistricting, and have a lot of perspective on this that I hope to share. The title of this presentation is Effective Representation Through Fair Redistricting. And this is important because redistricting is all about representation and ensuring that voters are represented by their elected officials and what their interests are. Fair redistricting, while fair is somewhat of a subjective word, that's the term that's generally been used to indicate that redistricting is reflective of the residents and voters of a specific area and their interests and needs. So rather than limited to a single group or maybe not the primary interests of those voters. So that's why we talk about fair redistricting and why the focus is effective representation. So it's making sure that your elected representatives are responsive to you and accountable to you. We start, and Vivian talked about our nonpartisan policy. Redistricting is a political process. It can be very partisan. It isn't necessarily partisan. And I'll talk a little bit about that, where we have nonpartisan bodies like county boards or school boards or city councils. It still is a highly political process. So, but we'll talk about this without reflecting a preference or a bias toward any party. The questions that came up that we'll address this evening, one is, what are the rules covering your districting at various levels? As you might imagine, redistricting is an incredibly complex topic. I've been working on this as a primary focus for probably 3.5 years, and I'm still learning things. And so I'll distill it down for those watching, and hope you can get the benefit. On the cover slide, I had my email address, phuffman@lwvmn.org, leagueofwomenvoters.org. If you just go to the state website, you'll find me listed under staff there. And you can send me an email if you have a question, you want more information, or if you have a group that you're a part of that would like more information on redistricting, if you'd like a presentation on this. So we'll talk about the rules covering your districting at varying levels, why some boundaries change and others don't. We'll talk about what happened in Minnesota and Washington County in 2022. And we'll talk about school districts and school district boundaries. That's a frequent topic. And I frankly have had, over the last 8 or 9 months, had to do a lot of research on this to understand better what rules apply to school districts and school redistricting and districts. So we'll talk about that a little bit. We'll talk about who's responsible for redistricting and how they can be held accountable, and where you can get more information, and then how to prepare for the next cycle. So we're going to cover all of these. As you can understand, there's a lot there, and we'll do everything we can to cover all that here in the time available. The first thing to talk about is, what is redistricting? So we toss that word around. We say it affects representation. So every census, it ties to the census. If you remember the census from 2020, by our Constitution, every 10 years, we have to take a count of all the persons in the United States. And based on that, three main things happen, and this league did a lot of great work on census education and mobilization response a couple of years ago. But it really affects three things. One is funding from the federal government to states. Is based on how many people, and then to cities and counties and other units of government. That is driven by population to a great extent. The second thing is strategic planning, what kind of services to provide and where. Businesses, manufacturing, marketing, they look at census data in order to understand where people are and provide those services. And then the last is representation. At the federal level, at the national level, this is called apportionment. And so the Census Bureau looks at the count of people in every state, and then determines, based on that number, how many of the 435 members of the House of Representatives each state gets. In 2020, actually came out earlier in this year, 2022, the Census Bureau announced that Minnesota would retain its 8th congressional seat by about 49 people. If we had counted 49 less people, then we would have lost a congressional seat. So that's really important, how we count every person and what that matters representation. If we had one less representative, that would be, basically 12% less voice in Congress for the people of Minnesota. Based on the census and apportionment data, the states draw lines for congressional and state legislative districts. That is redistricting. And this process happens all the way down at the county level, city level, some school boards, park board in Minneapolis. So it happens at every level of government, but it starts at the national level with the census, then an apportionment, and then at the state level with drawing those legislative congressional district boundaries. One thing I'll point out is that every state has its own process. Every state is different. And we tend to think that how we do it in Minnesota is how everybody does it. But in fact, nothing could be further from the truth. There are some generalities about how states do this, but it's different everywhere. So that's why the states are so important when it comes to redistricting. So why is redistricting important? I talked about representation, and I talked about effective and fair representation. So redistricting, depending on where people are sorted into districts, determines what voices are heard and what policy interests are being served. So you think about that, if you are in a place where you have a lot of people near you that all have similar interests, maybe it's around transportation or housing, or maybe it's some ethnic or national origins that you share, that you have some cultural things that are important to you, you would like your voices to be heard. But if you are maybe split between multiple districts, which happens, that's called cracking, or if you're all put into one district, which has happened in Alabama, where the Black residents of Alabama are crammed or packed into a single district, that then again limits the voices being heard. So when those group or community voices are diluted or isolated, cracked, isolated, packed, they may not be heard, and their interests may not, and in fact, aren't served. Excuse me, I got a little bit of a cold here. The last thing I'll say is there's a strong tendency to think about this at a national level and think as a party thing. This is not about parties. This is about policy. This is about what policies are important to you. And we see, this manipulation of district boundaries happening at every level of our government. One kind of fun fact that very few people know is that in Minnesota between 1913 and 1959, legislative boundaries were not changed. For over 40 years, legislative boundaries weren't changing. So think about all the things that happened between 1913 and 1959. Think about the movement from rural areas to urban areas, the increase of manufacturing in Minnesota around the urban areas. Think about all the immigration from Europe and all those people who came to Minnesota from Scandinavia and Northern and Central Europe. Think about the Great Migration from the South, where so many Black Americans moved from the South to escape Jim Crow and moved to places like Minneapolis. All those forces are occurring. And so that by the time the lines were redrawn in the late 1950s, a vote from rural Minnesota, Northwest Minnesota, is worth about 10 times what a vote from Minneapolis was. So it's fundamentally unfair. But that was really about urban versus rural interests. It wasn't about Democrat and Republican. The other example I'll bring to your attention, and this is kind of a current events issue. You may be aware of some of the controversy in Los Angeles right now around comments being made by members of the Los Angeles School Board, racially, biased comments. That all happened in the context of redistricting of the Los Angeles public schools, and the fight between Latino representation and Black representation, and who has the power, who's getting their voices heard. That is not about Democrats and Republicans. That is about whose policy interests, whose community interests are being heard and represented. So, this is not just a party thing. This is, between groups within a party, within and between other groups. So that's what I want you to think about. There's three elements we tend to talk about with redistricting, just briefly. The people who makes the decisions, draws the maps. In Minnesota, the people that draw the maps at every level pretty much are the people who benefit from that. So legislators, county commissioners, city council members, school board members. They're the ones who draw the maps. They're the ones who benefit from the maps if they are electoral districts. There's principles. Now, sometimes these are just what the legal requirements are, and we'll talk about the legal requirements here in a moment. There are other principles, and I'll talk about what the Minnesota State Supreme Court did in the most recent redistricting cycle. So you have an understanding of how that was done and what else is possible to be done both in Minnesota and is already being done in other states. And then finally, the process. What steps do you go through? Is there public comment and review? How is the public engaged? Is there accountability to the public? What is the opportunity for public to challenge in court, which can be very important? And in Minnesota, there's some limitations, for example, in county board maps with how long and how you can challenge those maps. It really has to be understood. And one of the things I say here is Minnesota, there was an independent analysis done a couple of years ago. Minnesota in the 2012 cycle, and 2022 is really not much better, was among the worst in the country for public input and involvement. We have very little in the way of legal protections for voters and ability to engage and intercede in state and local redistricting. So the rules, one of the questions is, what are the rules for redistricting in Minnesota? And so I'm going to divide this into levels. So what applies at every level? And this really is nationally, these are requirements. Districts have to be equal population. What equal means can vary depending on the level. At the congressional district level, you can get a lot closer from a percentage standpoint, although be off by, some fairly good sized numbers, hundreds of people, but still be percentage wise very close. From it has to be contiguous, which means continuous, that you can't have separate areas. Now, when you get to local districts, there can be some exceptions to this, but contiguous. So, it's got to be able to travel literally from any point in the district to another. And the final is not denying opportunity for minority representation. And this really comes from the Voting Rights Act for the most part, and also the 14th Amendment of the Constitution about equal protection. So that Voting Rights Act has been under severe challenge. We're not going to talk about that here, but it's something that everybody should be aware of and understand. So at the state level in Minnesota, this applies for the congressional districts, state Senate districts, and House districts. Those are all statewide maps. Every state draws these maps differently to some extent. In Minnesota, and this is similar to about 31 other states, the maps are created and approved by the legislature, and the governor approves or vetoes. That's the standard. There are a variety of other models for this. There's one state, North Carolina, where the governor gets no veto. So once the legislature has been gerrymandered in North Carolina, there's nothing the governor can do about it. Fortunately, they have some state laws that may help with that. The flip side is that's now being challenged in the U.S. Supreme Court here this year. District requirements for Minnesota, and what you'll see is this will vary a little bit depending on the level we're at. Equal population, and that can vary a bit depending on federal requirements. Contiguous, we talked about. Minority representation, we talked about, applies at every level. There is a requirement for nesting, and these are kind of technical issues that every House district has to be encompassed with a Senate district, and there's 2 House districts per Senate district. That's in our Constitution. Numbering in our statute, there is words about numbering, and they've got to be numbered from northwest to southeast, which is why many of you are going to see that your legislative district number changed. Well, that is primarily because the numbering changed throughout the state, primarily around the metro area due to the changes in redistricting and what those numbers were. The number of districts we have is governed by law. There are 67 Senate districts and 2 House districts, Senate districts, 134 House districts. That is governed by law. The legislature can change that, but nobody else can. And then the numbering, which we talked about. So then we talk about counties. Well, going back for the state level, you notice there aren't a lot of rules. There's nothing about how they have meetings, nothing about public input, nothing about public challenge, nothing about public review. All those things are done in other states. And matter of fact, states that you would not think of having strong democratic principles, like maybe Oklahoma. So Minnesota, there's a lot of opportunity from a transparency and public involvement standpoint, as well as principles and other things to limit the ability to consider, for example, incumbency and there where they live. Iowa, for example, has rules in their statute about not looking at past election results, not looking at residents of incumbent lawmakers. Minnesota does not have those rules. For counties, this includes a county board, which we all think about, but then also soil and water conservation districts. No, not conversation, conservation districts. They are approved by the county board. Again, think about the people who have the maps, also who benefit from the maps, also are the ones who approve the maps. The number of districts is determined by statute and a county board. Statute says that counties will have 5 commissioners unless it's changed by the county board. You got to have at least 100,000 people, which Washington County does, in order to change. Washington County is the only county. Washington County is the 5th most populous county in the state, and is the only one of the top 8 with only 5 commissioners. So that is a question about the effectiveness of representation, the ability to ensure that all of our communities are represented with 5 commissioner districts. So that's a topic that could be discussed with county board members. There's a requirement to be regular and compact. You remember, this is not a requirement on national or state level districts. There is a provision in the law about geography, but you can look at counties, and I have looked at some counties, and there are examples where counties flat out do not follow that, where there's been involvement by board leaders and with administrators to draw lines that are beneficial and preferred to by certain incumbents. So regular and compact, you look at districts, are they kind of regular shaped? Are they maybe oddly shaped? If they're oddly shaped, that's kind of a sign that may not meet the statute in Minnesota. They have to follow precinct boundaries. So there's, a sequence in Minnesota. The first thing that happens is that the legislative and congressional district lines get drawn. The precinct lines get drawn by cities, and if there's unincorporated areas, by the counties, usually along township boundaries. Townships typically define a precinct at a county level. And then you draw city council and then county board member boundaries, so that county commissioners and city council members all fall within a certain precinct. And then population is equal as practicable, but within 10% of the average. So legally, what that requires is that the populations are all as equal as possible. But then if there's reasons due to the precincts that it can't be more equal than that, then it has to all be within 10% of the average. The exceptions really have to do with splitting precincts. Remember, county board districts have to follow precinct boundaries. What's happened around the state is that with more mail-in voting, that more precincts are getting bigger with more people, and that limits the ability to reach population equality and county board representation. So that's something that we're looking at and possibly trying to influence, and how those precinct boundaries get drawn in order to affect effective representation. So now the cities, there's about 80 cities in Minnesota with wards. Of the 10 largest cities, only Maple Grove and Woodbury don't have wards. Wards are really helpful when you have large cities to ensure effective representation. If you think about Woodbury, there's the county board, the city council members, which we elect all at large in Woodbury. City council members and the mayor all live within about a 1 mile radius of one another in south central Woodbury. There's a lot of people who live maybe in the western part of Woodbury who have different needs and concerns, or in the eastern part of Woodbury that may have different needs or concerns. Those city council members will work to represent everyone, but the reality is that it's hard to always represent people that who don't have your lived experience. So I think it's important to think about that as a avenue for effective representation as wards. And that's, again, a whole different topic about what is effective representation within a city and some of the other models within Minnesota. The maps for ward boundaries are approved by the city council in most cases, or the charter commission in some. I know, for example, that in Minneapolis, St. Paul, and White Bear Lake, though their ward boundaries are approved by the charter commission. And so both of those are a little problematic. City council, because they're approving maps for themselves. The charter commission is problematic because the charter commission is not an elected body. They are appointed typically by the chief judge of the municipal court for that jurisdiction. And they are then, an unelected appointed body to draw maps. And what we've seen in some cases is that the charter commissions are not reflective of the overall demographics of the community. And in fact, in one case, the charter commission it ignored the desires of the city council in that city with regards to redistricting, and did a map that effectively was a least change, perpetuate the existing status quo on demographics and representation. In Minneapolis, that only changed once a advisory commission was provided through an amendment for the city charter in 2010, which resulted in a much more representative government in the city council in Minneapolis. Again, the requirements are population equals practicable, they're compact, and they follow precinct boundaries. And as I mentioned, the cities draw the precinct lines. They will generally draw the precinct lines at the same time that they draw the ward boundaries, because the two go together and they control both processes. So that works very well for them. A lot of discussion about school districts. And I mentioned earlier that I have done a good bit of research on school districts. The short answer on this is that think of school districts as governmental units like cities or counties. School district boundaries are defined based on those governmental boundaries. The school district boundaries are not limited by population or limited by geography. They are whatever they've been set historically. In this case, if you think about the city of Woodbury, the city limits have been roughly the same for 30 years, but yet the population has grown dramatically. The South Washington County School District boundary and the Stillwater School District boundary have stayed the same for decades. But at the same time, the populations and the distribution of the tax base in those areas have changed dramatically. In the Stillwater District, which is District 834, they've had a huge shift in population, growth in population in the southern part of that district, which is in northeastern Woodbury. And so they've actually built schools in the southern part of that district and closed schools in the northern part of that district, because that's where the students are. There's been a lot of anxiety around that. In the South Washington County District, there's been a lot of growth in southern Woodbury and northern Cottage Grove, which resulted in, of course, East Ridge High School being built, other schools being built or expanded, but then also potentially other schools being closed, such as in Newport. So school districts are defined by their geographic boundaries, and those don't change. There are statutory approaches to change that. That really is something between school boards and the state government, and how to change that. It is not something that is part of redistricting. There's also school district attendance boundaries. That is what school do students attend based on where they live. I know personally, this is one of the most contentious issues out there. We live in Eastern Woodbury. Our son went to what's called Liberty Ridge Elementary. It was a brand new elementary school. He was in 6th grade. But then the following year, there was a big development going in around that school. That school was being built in anticipation of that population. The boundaries were drawn a couple of years later, such that we can see the school from our house, but yet none of the children in our neighborhood can go there because it's all that area around that school. So district attendance boundaries are incredibly contentious, very emotional, and they're defined by the school boards. But again, that's within that governmental boundary of the school district. And it's not driven by census, it's driven by school census or school attendance, and to drive that drawing of the boundaries. There are school districts with electoral districts like county board districts or city wards where they have members elected by geography. The three that I am aware of, I'm not aware of any others, are Minneapolis School District, the Hanoka Heaven School District, and the Duluth School District. So, and there are provisions in statute to create electoral districts for school boards. It's actually, to me, doesn't look that onerous, but everything is going to meet with resistance to the status quo, and it's got to be thought about very intentionally. Those school board electoral boundaries, just like every other level, they're governed by the school board. And so the school board decides what those lines are going to be, and therefore who they are going to represent. So I think what you see at every level of government in Minnesota is that the people who are elected draw the districts. Now they're going to tell you that I can represent my constituents, and I can do the best thing, and I can work with my counterparts to make good decisions. And I believe those individual elected officials, whether legislators or county board members or city council members, I believe them. But in a group, especially as parties, there's just too much at stake. And just like we heard about with Los Angeles and their school board, the same thing happens at county boards. And we witnessed it specifically with the Washington County Board on those those Washington County Commissioner districts, that there are certain interests that those county board members have in how those lines are drawn. In some cases, they may actually say that out loud. In other cases, they don't, but you see it in the effects of what they do and what options they support. So in the districts, have to be as equal in population as possible and compact. So again, it depends on school district shapes and geography, about how you do that. So that's the rules each level. Some things that are consistent with population, contiguous, minority representation, but some things that are different, especially when you get to the local with being compact, and then, some other aspects of that. There's a number of ways to draw maps. I'm just going to show this briefly. Given the limited number of rules around maps are drawn, if you have to equalize population, you can draw maps either to have fair representation. And I would say that neither of the two maps here are fair because they provide predictable, consistent outcomes where, that may or may not be representative of the people. If you've got 50 precincts, 40% are yellow, 60% are green. So if you do 5 districts, there ought to be 2 yellow, 3 green, but there ought to be a district that's maybe like a swingy district so that, there is some potential that power shifts from one party to the other. In the middle case, green has set it up because they control a majority of the votes that they always win, and they win everything 5-0. That's gerrymandering. The one on the right is one where yellow's done the same thing. They have basically packed the green into a certain number of districts so to minimize their voices and ensured that the yellow has, an overrepresentative voice in what decisions get made. So that's, so there's literally infinite number of ways to draw maps. And many of those are legal. As a matter of fact, infinite ways are legal maps. The question is, are they good maps? Are they fair representation? In Minnesota, we'll talk a little bit about what happened in Minnesota. This is the congressional districts on the left and the Senate districts on the right. The darker blue, and this is based on 2020 census data, and what the districts were going into redistricting this cycle at the state level. The dark blue indicates they were under the necessary population. If you take our population in Minnesota, divided by 8, that's what you should get. on the right. What you see is the 67 Senate districts. If you divide the population by 67, there's a population you should have. If it's blue, dark blue, or dark blue green, that's way under the necessary. If it's brown of some shade, that means it's over. The darker the blue or the darker the brown, the more over or under. So what that tells you is that and as you see it also, more in the right hand picture, is that areas with larger populations, especially urban areas, you go from northwest to southeast, you got Moorhead in the northwest, then you come down toward the southeast, you got St. Cloud, and then you got the Twin Cities Metro. You notice in the Twin Cities Metro, the most growth is in the suburban areas. And that is what we saw at a precinct level throughout the state, was that the growth was really more at the suburbs, first and second ring suburbs, and then outer suburbs, than it was at the urban cores. And then going down to the right, you see Rochester area. Just toward the middle south of the state is Mankato. So those urban areas had the most growth. So what that means is those districts in greater Minnesota have to get bigger to encompass more people. Those districts that are brown have to be smaller to encompass fewer people. So all those districts are going to change. There's a chance that district boundaries aren't going to change, but especially legislative boundaries and congressional boundaries, they all changed. They all changed at the congressional and legislative level, because even if you have a district, like some of these are right at the right population, the districts around them have to get bigger. And so they're going to have to push that district in a different direction. So even if you are in a district that's at the right population, from a state standpoint, they pretty much all changed. I am not aware of a single one whose boundaries did not change, and I don't see how any of them could not change based on those numbers. The other thing from a state standpoint to understand, and I'll talk about this here in a minute, is that the courts drew the congressional and legislative maps, and they hold themselves to a degree of accuracy that is not required of the legislature. So they sought to make congressional districts equal within one person. So, and so just think about that. What they're doing is trying to make sure that they are making legal maps. And so that really just says that all those drawing lines are going to have to change. The legislative districts, they had a little more leeway that they took, but not a lot. Again, so all of those are going to change. So things that didn't happen. No legislation. We've been working on others with partners for 5 years trying to change the rules around redistricting to prevent partisan gerrymandering. Nothing got done. We are working ahead on that. Neither chamber approved any maps. There were maps introduced in the committees in both chambers of the legislature, but nothing got approved. Many, if not most, counties were unresponsive to public input and comment on commissioner district maps. Some were actually hostile to input and comment on maps. And I won't say names or say places, but it was pretty apparent the commissioners had in those places, they had maps, they had a thing that they wanted to do, and they were not going to be swayed from that. City charter commissions generally were not responsive to public comment or city councils. Brooklyn Park, it was one that I think was, based on feedback I've gotten. But in general, again, they're appointed, they're unelected, they don't have any expiration or recall on their service. So those charter commissions really pretty insensitive to public interest, public need. St. Paul, I mentioned St. Paul, they didn't even start their redistricting process until early in the year. I know that there were cities because I talked to them and I saw presentations that were working on this back in September of last year, September of 2021. Other cities were saying, and counties were saying, well, I can't do anything because I don't have the data. They had the data if they really wanted to do something. That is just a fact, because other jurisdictions, cities were doing something. So, I mean, they were not responsive. And because they want to draw the maps that they want to draw. In some cases, those county maps didn't change. For example, Rice County, Minnesota, which is where Northfield and Faribault are. They are not the most equal maps, but the county approved a map that was the same, no change, and they justified that. There is an average for litigation. We weren't prepared to do that, but the county approved a map that had no change and basically limits the voices of minority groups in Faribault, which is very diverse, and Northfield. So that's in the counties. I'll talk about Washington County here in a couple of moments. What did happen? Well, the state Supreme Court drew maps when the legislature did not create and approve maps. If you think back to what I talked about, what the process is and what the rules are, nowhere in that do the courts appear. That's a whole nother conversation, but the courts are not supposed to be drawing the maps. The legislature is supposed to. The last three cycles, 2002, 2012, 2022, the legislature could not agree on the map because of divided government. And that has been the story of Minnesota for the last 60 years, is divided government. The good news is that divided government means no, we have not been gerrymandered. If you want an example of that, look no further than across the St. Croix River in Wisconsin. And we can have that conversation if you are interested. But so the Supreme Court drew the maps when the legislature did not. The bad part about this is they only do a least change map. So they're not going to make maps that meet all of the best interests and needs of the people of Minnesota. They're going to make a map that is legal. They do take comments in writing around the state, public comments and statements in writing. And they also adopted a comprehensive set of redistricting principles, emphasizing notably preserving Native American voting power, ensuring minority representation, and preserving communities of interest. And then they also strengthened the language about ensuring districts are not drawn to the benefit or disadvantage of an elected official. It's important to note that these are not binding on the legislature or later courts. You will hear lawmakers talk about, well, the courts do such a great job. Remember, the courts aren't supposed to draw the maps. They're doing this. They talk about the process and rules the court uses are good. Well, it's good, but they are not binding on the legislature. So I would suspect that the parties, either party, would not necessarily bind themselves to those rules unless they were in their self-interest. And I mentioned the courts adopted a least change map. The problem is least change maps, and this is what happened in St. Paul, as the Charter Commission adopted a least change map. It perpetuates existing representation. And I would tell you that the Washington County Board did the same thing, and they explicitly in their board meeting accepting the map, they said, we have to do a least change map. That is not true. Least change maps are required by the courts because they are not empowered to make policy. No elected officials, when they are required to do a least change map, unless they desire to do a least change map. So I think that's something that we have to bear in mind. That is not a legal requirement for county boards or city councils or the legislature. The Northern Minnesota Native American tribal areas are included in CD8. That was a big win. I personally had an opportunity to work with the Native American community in Bemidji. That was something they really strongly wanted. All the tribal communities up in that area, the Red Lake, Leech Lake, and White Earth bands, they all wanted their tribal areas in one congressional district. They've been split between CD7 and CD8. They are now all in CD8. The maps paired a lot of incumbents. And that's because the Supreme Court did not look at the court panel they appointed, did not look at residences of the incumbents. The majority minority opportunity districts increased significantly. The Supreme Court noted the arguments from some of the interveners and others about the importance of recognizing and responding to the minority population growth in Minnesota. And that's why we kept our 8th congressional seat. So the state Senate increased from 8 to 15 majority, minority, or minority opportunity districts, and from 22 to 31 of those districts. So more opportunity for minority representation. Because the maps are a least change map, and because it wasn't one of their criteria for either competitiveness or anything along those lines, the maps are likely more favorable to Republicans than the DFL because it really reflects historical sorting and historical trends in what those maps were. Washington County, those are the one on the left is the county board map as it existed in 2012. The right is the county board map as exists after the 2022 redistricting. And if you look at those, they look awfully similar, and that's because they are. That was part of the decision making of the county board, is basically to keep the maps as much the same as they are. There are benefits in least change maps. It makes election administration easier because it's less changes in precinct boundaries, precinct and ballots. It's easier to educate voters about who they're voting for. I'm a head election judge in Grant in Washington County. Grant is a city of about 3,500 people. It's now split between 2 Senate districts in the state due to redistricting by the courts. And so all these people who've been voting in Grant for years and years and years in one precinct, they now enter their polling place and there are 2 precincts there. So that's been a bit of a challenge. So there is reason to favor least change districts. It's good for the elected official because they don't have to get to know a new area. It's not good for residents because they are not necessarily getting the best representation. So, there's not a huge change. If you look in the Washington County maps, the Commissioner District 5 had to get a little smaller. And if you look, District 2 shifted, had picked up some area in the northern part of Woodbury. And if you look at District 3, they gave up a little bit of land to District 1, and District 4 gave up a little bit to I thought they gave up some to District 3, but they were pretty much the same. If you think about it, Cottage Grove is in District 4, Woodbury is in District 5, and a little bit in 4 and a little bit in 2. And 2 is where most of Oakdale is. So the growth is mainly in Oakdale, Woodbury, Cottage Grove. And so that's where a lot of the changes in the lines occurred. All right, and this is at the state level. You can see it's probably pretty hard to see, but you can see that you get the lines up, that on the left where CDC 8 was mostly to the northeast and went down a bit. Now it goes further across in the north, a much sharper cut across the center of the state. And then it now goes down on CD8, goes all the way down to northern Washington County. CD6, which kind of has wrapped around the top of the metro for many years, it now goes around only as far as the Washington County line, because that was one of the bigger growing districts. And so that gave up some land to CD8. The CD4 got smaller, CD5 got smaller. CD1 and CD7 had to get bigger. Some of its territory went over to CD8. And so that goes all, now down a lot into the West Metro and the Southwest Metro, picked up some territory from CD6. And CD2 gave up a lot of territory to CD1. So CD1, and I was part of the, observed the testimony to the courts. There was a lot of feeling that Southeast Minnesota along the Mississippi River shared a lot culturally and historically and geographically. And so there's, that goes all the way up through to Goodhue County now being in CD1, and that all was CD2 last cycle. So that shows you kind of what happened with that. The current state, I would say that Minnesota remains vulnerable to statewide gerrymandering. City councils in some large cities remain at large. City and county officials are resistant to public input and or use least change approach. City charters don't reflect commitments or interests of some councils and don't hold officials accountable to the interests of voters because they're unelected. Minority communities are the most interested, motivated, and impacted. And this is one of the things I have really learned from this experience the last several years. I think the non-white communities are those who are, growing the most, who have seen the most change demographically, economically, but because of least change maps and unresponsive governmental bodies, they're the ones the most impacted. So, for example, we have a majority minority city in Worthington, Minnesota. They have no minority members on their city council. There are efforts to develop people for those positions, but that's very hard. Woodbury as a city has 28% non-white, but yet no members of our city council are non-white. And one of the things to be important is that interest groups are continuing to work on redistricting. Those that both who have an interest one way or the other in redistricting. Nationally, I'll just be brief. Once a state is gerrymandered, it becomes almost impossible to reverse it. Used to be, we said, oh, gerrymandering is only a 10-year problem. No, it is a generational issue. With control of legislatures, and I'll give two examples. One is Maryland, which has a gerrymandered supermajority Democratic majority, and Kentucky, a gerrymandered Republican supermajority. They have governors of the opposite party. The governors attempted to veto the maps. The same thing happened in Louisiana, but the legislature just overrides the veto. So you can't reverse it. And Wisconsin is a whole nother conversation. The number of competitive seats in Congress has been reduced. There's only about 10 to 20 competitive seats in Congress anymore due to gerrymandering by both parties. The national trend is toward greater partisan focus on local redistricting, including counties, school boards, and we've talked about some of that. Those are nonpartisan races and nonpartisan bodies, but yet partisan groups are taking great interest and great involvement in representation in those areas. And nationally, for us and other groups, we've agreed that we cannot demobilize from redistricting. And we are all creating longer range plans and maintaining our organizations in anticipation of 2032. Focus areas, local redistricting, that is the way that we and you can take action in the near term. Work on local redistricting, pursue city or school district electoral districts. We've talked about that. There's a process in statute for doing that. Revise city charters when you have one to provide greater protections, including potentially a citizen advisory commission or independent commission, including principles that would be required to be followed by the charter commission. And then build community understanding and engagement. And that's all in preparing for 2030. That builds some of that coalition and foundation for local redistricting and state level redistricting. At a state level, we are working with our partners from 2020 and going forward, and the target is 2026 for a constitutional amendment in Minnesota to change the rules on redistricting as they exist in our state constitution and to establish what's called the Independent Redistricting Commission. And that, again, is a whole nother conversation. So with that, I'll open up for any questions that there may be on this. I know I've covered a lot of material here pretty quickly. As Dawn said, this will be recorded and available for viewing later. And I'm happy to engage with anyone one-on-one or as a group outside of this program.
Thank you very much for speaking up and telling us all of that interesting and I'm sure hard-won information. So I am not happy about the shape of the district I'm in. I feel that there's a lot of folks in it that aren't used to working with my part of the district. So I'm wondering if there's much hope in changing that by the time we get to the next census.
Joan, the short answer is no. Those districts only get changed once every 10 years. So that's why it's so important to be prepared when that redistricting comes around and then to make voices heard. It's interesting that, there were Now, I would give the special redistricting panel, the Supreme Court appointed a panel of 5 judges, diversity and geography, demographics, and political orientation. So it was a really good panel, but they really worked to listen to people who gave testimony. And it was interesting how few people gave testimony to that group, but listening to the consistency of some of it. I mentioned Southeast Minnesota, but where people Dave gave testimony that was consistent and reinforced, the court was very responsive to that. So, but once those lines are drawn, that's why it's so critical to be prepared and engaged when that opportunity comes around.
Thank you.
Does anyone else have a question or comment?
As far as finding other information, what I would direct everybody to is the League of Women Voters Minnesota website. There is a section that's our issues, and under that, and what I'll do is I'll bring it up here real quick. Give me a moment. Okay, I'll share this real quick. All right, if you go to the League of Women Voters Minnesota website, right here where we stand, redistricting. And this is basically our redistricting information on this page. You come down, there's a lot of resources to educate you about redistricting, additional information on redistricting, just as a starting point. So lots of information here if you're interested about redistricting. And then there's some other links here to proposed maps, that was submitted by League of Women Voters along with our co-plaintiffs. We were a co-plaintiff on the lawsuit. And there is a link here for an interactive map on the congressional districts. And so you can go, and this is in something called Dave's Redistricting app. It's actually pretty easy to use. And you can go in and get more information there, but what are the maps? And you can zoom in on those. So just a couple of quick resources for you there to refer to. And again, I have other different lists and sorts of resources depending on what your interest is. And I think the best thing is, start with that as an education point. I will also commend the Brennan Center too. The Brennan Center is out of New York, at New York University. They have a lot of great information on redistricting and what's happened. There are a lot of resources online. It can be a little overwhelming at times. So please, everybody, P. Huffman at lwvmn.org. If you've got any questions or want to have a separate discussion, as I've told people, I will go anywhere, anytime, and talk to whatever number of people about redistricting, because it only takes a few of us to be the critical mass and to bring others along and help be ready when we need to engage more. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. I guess our meeting is scheduled to end at 6 o'clock. So if everyone, or if no one has any other comments or questions, maybe we should move on to our closing. Vivian's saying thank you. It was excellent as usual. Okay, so I'm going to piggyback a little bit on Paul and then on Paul's presentation, and then mention some plans of our League of Women Voters Woodbury Cottage Grove redistricting team. So redistricting means all state and local decisions on healthcare, jobs, the environment, education, and more rely on fair maps. So that's pretty much affects all of us somewhere in there. The goal of redistricting is to, as Paul said, to provide fair and effective representation for everyone. And we know that we can achieve that goal by actively participating in our community and the redistricting process. And I'll have to say, to Paul's point, especially with the tribes in the tribal communities in CD8, they were there, their voices were heard, and they were very intentional, and it paid off. Hopefully, well, I guess we'll see in the election. I will also say, and you may have noticed this, there's many Native candidates that are running for city council, Senate, positions. And I think that, some of that came around redistricting. I mean, they were energized. Of course, it's voting also, but for the League of Women Voters, Woodbury Cottage Grove area, we will continue to focus on local government. We feel that that's very important. Primarily, we have focused on the county, but a little bit on city. So at this time, we are in the planning stage for the future of the redistricting team with our Woodbury Cottage Grove Area League. So I cannot tell you what that will look like right now. I will encourage you to stay engaged. Use, like Paul showed us, the resources on our website. Please, if you have any ideas, questions, comments, reach out to Paul or myself or the league. We welcome and we encourage any and all of your input and involvement. And I guess I would sincerely thank all of you for participating, Paul for presenting once again. And please stay engaged and contact us if you have any further comments, questions, or ideas. For now, unless anyone else had any comments, we'll say goodnight.